In 1942, the German Luftwaffe ruled the skies over Europe. They had met the American B-17 Flying Fortress. They respected it. It was tough. It was hard to kill. But then they saw a new shape in the sky. The consolidated B-24 Liberator. It was ugly. It was boxy. It sat low to the ground on tricycle landing gear. It had a deep, slab-sided fuselage. The German pilots looked at it and laughed. They called it the mobile wagon. The furniture van. They mocked its appearance. They mocked its durability. The B-17 could take a beating and fly home. The B-24 was fragile. If you hit the wing in the wrong spot, it snapped off. If you hit the hydraulics, the plane filled with flammable mist. The German aces viewed the B-24 as the easy kill in the formation. They would weave through the bomber streams. They would look for the boxy shapes. Attack the vans, they would radio. They burn faster. The Germans focused on the tactical flaws. They missed the strategic reality. They didn't ask why the Americans were building this ugly plane. They didn't realize it had a superpower. It was faster than the B-17. And it could fly further. Much further. The Germans were laughing at a truck. They didn't realize that truck was carrying the fuel to burn down their eye. The secret of the B-24 was in its wings. The B-17 had a thick, broad wing. It generated massive lift. It could take a lot of battle damage. But it created a lot of drag. It was slow. The designers of the B-24 wanted speed. They used a revolutionary design. The Davis wing. It was long. It was thin. It was tapered like a glider's wing. Wind tunnel tests showed it was incredibly efficient. It sliced through the air with minimal drag. This meant the B-24 could cruise faster than the B-17. It meant it burned less fuel to carry the same weight. It was a masterpiece of aerodynamics. But there was a trade-off. The wing was thin. It couldn't hold massive internal spars like the B-17. It relied on a stressed skin construction. It was strong in flight. But it was weak in combat. A 20mm cannon shell could shatter the structure. The wing would fold up. The plane would drop like a stone. German pilots learned to aim for the wing roots. They saw B-24s disintegrate. They thought this proved American incompetence. Why build a glass wing, they scoffed. They didn't understand the American calculation. The Americans accepted the fragility. They needed the range. They needed a plane that could cross the Atlantic. They needed a plane that could reach the oil fields. The Germans laughed at the fragility. But the Davis wing was carrying the war to places the Luftwaffe couldn't defend. The German defense of the Reich was based on geography. They knew the range of Allied fighters. They knew the range of Allied bombers. They drew circles on their maps. Here, the general said, pointing to central Germany. Here we are vulnerable. Then they pointed to the east. To Romania. To the vast oil fields of Ploesti. Here, they said, we are safe. Ploesti supplied 60% of Germany's crude oil. It was the fuel pump of the war machine. It was deep in the Balkans. It was too far for a B-17 to fly from England. It was too far to fly from Africa with a heavy bomb load. The Germans built air defenses there, but they were relaxed. They didn't expect a heavy raid. The distance was a shield. But the B-24 didn't care about distance. With its efficient wings and massive fuel tanks, it was a marathon runner. The Americans gathered a force of liberators in Libya. They planned a mission that defied German logic. A 2,400-mile round trip. They loaded the planes with extra fuel. They loaded them with bombs. They were going to fly to the edge of the map. The German strategists slept soundly. They believed in the limits of technology. They believed the Americans were tied to their bases. They didn't know that the B-24 was designed to break the leash. The furniture van was about to make a long-distance delivery. August 1, 1943. The B-24s took off from the desert. 177 of them. They flew across the Mediterranean. They flew across the mountains of Albania. They dropped down into the Danube Valley. The plan was audacious. They wouldn't bomb from high altitude. They would fly on the deck, 50 feet off the ground. They wanted to sneak under the German radar. They wanted to hit the refineries before the smoke screen could cover them. When the B-24s arrived over Ploesti, it was chaos. They were flying so low they were clipping cornstalks. The German and Romanian gunners were stunned. They saw heavy bombers flying like fighters. They depressed their anti-aircraft guns to fire horizontally. They fired point-blank into the faces of the American pilots. The B-24s flew through a wall of fire. They flew through the intense heat of burning oil tanks. German flak trains ran parallel to the bombers. They engaged in a duel at 100 miles per hour. B-24s exploded. They crashed into the refineries. But they dropped their bombs. The refineries erupted. Explosions rocked the earth. Columns of black smoke rose thousands of feet. The Germans shot down 53 aircraft. It was a bloodbath. But the oil stopped flowing. The German high command was shaken. They realized their safe zone was gone. If the Americans could hit Ploesti from Africa, they could hit anything. The BR-24 had proven that distance was dead. The Germans had underestimated the reach of the ugly bomber. And now, their tanks were going to pay the price. The German pilots called it a furniture van from the outside. The American crews called it a flying boxcar from the inside. It was not a term of endearment. The B-17 was cramped, but it felt like a warplane. The B-24 felt like a warehouse. The fuselage was cavernous. It was dark and drafty. To get from the nose to the tail, the crew had to walk on a narrow catwalk. It ran right down the center of the bomb bay. There were no doors on the bomb bay. Just roller shutters. When they were open, you were walking on a 9-inch plank over 20,000 feet of empty space. One slip, and you were gone. The fuselage was also a maze of hydraulic lines. The B-24 used high-pressure fluid for everything: landing gear, flaps, turrets. These lines leaked constantly. The floor of a B-24 was usually slick with red hydraulic fluid. When flak hit a B-17, it punched holes. When flak hit a B-24, it often severed a hydraulic line. The cabin would fill with a fine, flammable mist. A single spark would ignite it. The plane would become a flying torch. The Germans didn't know about the interior layout. They just knew that when they hit a Bu-24 hard, it often erupted in flames. For the American crews, it was a nerve-wracking ride. They knew they were flying in a giant fuel tank with a fragile nervous system. But they also knew they could carry 8,000 pounds of bombs. It was a trade-off. Safety for payload. The B-24 had another design feature that the Germans learned to exploit. Its nose. It was a massive greenhouse of plexiglass. It gave the bombardier and navigator an incredible view. But it offered zero protection. German fighter tactics evolved. They stopped attacking from the rear, where the .50 caliber guns were heavy. They attacked head-on. A flight of FW-190s would line up directly in front of the bomber formation. They would close at a combined speed of 600 miles per hour. They aimed for the glass noses. It was terrifying for the German pilots. They were playing chicken with a massive bomber. It was worse for the American crews in the nose. They would see the German fighters growing rapidly in their windscreen. They would see the winking flashes of their 20mm cannons. Then the glass would shatter. Cannon shells would rip through the nose compartment. Bombardiers and navigators were decapitated. Pilots were killed instantly in the cockpit behind them. The B-24 was vulnerable to this attack because its forward firepower was often weak in early models. The Germans mocked the design. They saw it as American naivety. Building a warplane with a glass front. But the Americans adapted. They added power turrets to the nose. But for many crews in 1943, the greenhouse was a death trap. It was a clear target that German pilots, desperate to stop the bombing, aimed for with deadly precision. While the Germans were shooting down B-24s over Europe, the Americans were doing something the Axis couldn't comprehend. They were building them on an assembly line. The Germans built aircraft in batches. It was a slow, meticulous process involving skilled craftsmen. The Americans turned to the auto industry. Henry Ford built a factory at Willow Run, Michigan. It was the largest room in the world. The assembly line was a mile long. The German High Command heard rumors of this factory. They dismissed them as propaganda. They couldn't believe that a complex machine like a 4-engine bomber could be built like a Model T. Willow Run was a river of aluminum. At one end, raw materials came in. They were stamped, riveted, and assembled by tens of thousands of workers, many of them women, Rosie the riveters. The line never stopped moving. At its peak, Willow Run was producing one complete B-24 every 63 minutes. One an hour. 24 hours a day. The Germans could shoot down 50 bombers in a massive air battle. It was a catastrophe for the USAF. But within 2 days, Willow Run had replaced them all. It was a war of attrition that Germany could not win. Their pilots were exhausted. Their machines were wearing out. And every day, a fresh stream of brand new Liberators was flowing across the Atlantic. The Germans mocked the furniture van for its looks. They didn't realize it was the ultimate product of industrial warfare. Quantity has a quality all its own. And the B-24 had quantity that was unimaginable to the German mind. By 1944, the B-24 was demonstrating its strategic range in a way that infuriated the Luftwaffe. The Allies set up shuttle bombing missions. Operation Frantic. B-24s based in Italy would take off. They would fly north. They would bomb targets deep in Germany or Eastern Europe. Targets that were previously out of range. But they didn't turn around and fly back into the teeth of the German defenses. They kept flying east. They landed at Soviet airfields in Ukraine, like Poltava. The German air defense system was set up to catch bombers coming in and going out toward the west. They weren't prepared for bombers that just kept going. The B-24s would land in Russia. The crews would rest. The planes would be refueled and rearmed. Then, a few days later, they would take off again. They would bomb another target on the way back to Italy. The Luftwaffe was stretched to the breaking point. They had to defend every corner of the Reich simultaneously. There was no safe direction. German fighter wings would scramble to intercept the bombers, fuel tanks low, only to realize the Americans were flying away from them, toward Russian territory where they couldn't follow. It was a logistical triumph made possible by the B-24's incredible range. The furniture van was crisscrossing the continent, delivering destruction on a schedule that the Germans couldn't interrupt. The pilots who had laughed at the plane in 1942 were now chasing shadows, unable to predict where the blow would fall next. By late 1944, the true strategic impact of the B-24 became undeniable. The oil campaign, begun at Ploesti, had become a systematic strangulation. The B-24s, along with the B-17s, hammered synthetic oil plants deep inside Germany. These were targets the Germans thought were safe. The results were catastrophic for the Wehrmacht. The German army had thousands of tanks. The Luftwaffe had thousands of fighters, including the new, terrifying Me-262 jet. But they couldn't move. The Germans were masters of engineering. They had built the best weapons in the world. But they had underestimated the importance of the fuel that powered them. At airfields across Germany, brand new fighters sat on the tarmac. Their fuel tanks were empty. Pilots were told to only run engines for essential combat sorties. Training flights were cancelled. The once mighty panzer divisions were reduced to using oxen to pull their tanks into defensive positions. The B-24s had destroyed the lifeblood of the German war machine. German commanders, who had once mocked the clumsy American bombers, now watched helplessly as their own superior technology became useless junk. They realized too late that the B-24's range and payload were not just statistics. They were strategic weapons that could bypass the battlefield and destroy the means to fight. The furniture vans had delivered a death blow to the German economy. The war was effectively over. It was just a matter of time until the engine finally seized. While most B-24s carried bombs, some carried secrets. The B-24's massive fuselage made it the perfect platform for a new kind of warfare, electronic intelligence, ELINT. These were the Tiferet aircraft. They flew alone, usually at night. They weren't looking for targets to destroy. They were listening. The fuselage was packed with radio receivers, oscilloscopes, and wire recorders. The exterior bristled with dozens of strange-looking antennas. German radar technology was advanced. The Wurzburg and Freya radars guided their night fighters and flak guns with deadly accuracy. The job of the ferret crews was to fly into German radar coverage and get painted by the beams. They would record the frequencies, pulse repetition rates, and scan patterns of the German radar sites. It was a terrifying game of cat and mouse. The ferret crew knew that every time they picked up a signal, a German radar operator was looking right at them, guiding guns or fighters to their position. They had to stay long enough to get the data, but leave before they were shot down. The intelligence gathered by the BE-24 ferrets was crucial. It allowed the Allies to develop radar jammers, like Window or Chaff. It allowed them to map the German air defense network and plan routes around the heaviest concentrations. The Germans knew these lone planes were up there. They tried to hunt them down. But the ferrets were elusive, disappearing into the electronic noise they helped create. The Germans had laughed at the B-24's appearance, but they learned to fear the silent, antenna-covered versions that were mapping their electronic nervous system. The BE-24 had one final, tragic flaw that haunted its crews. The high-mounted Davis wing was great for efficiency, but it was a death sentence in a water landing. Ditching a bomber in the ocean is always dangerous. But a BE-17, with its low wing, could often skid along the surface like a boat. The fuselage would stay intact for a few minutes, allowing the crew to escape into life rafts. The BE-24 was different. When a BE-24 hit the water, the deep fuselage would plow in. The massive, heavy wing, mounted high on top, carried tremendous momentum. Almost invariably, the fuselage would snap in two just behind the wing. The nose section would dive underwater immediately. The tail section might float for a few seconds before sinking. The break usually occurred right where the radio operator and engineers were stationed. Survivors of BE-24 ditchings were rare. If the plane broke up, the crew was often trapped inside the sinking sections or killed by the impact of the wing crushing the fuselage. The Germans often saw BE-24s shot down over the North Sea or the Mediterranean. They noted how quickly they disappeared after hitting the water. It was a grim reality for the American airmen. They knew that if they took battle damage over water, their chances of survival were slim. It was the dark side of the design trade-off. The same feature that gave the plane its range also made it a coffin in the sea. The war ended in 1945. The bombers flew home. The BE-17 Flying Fortress became the icon of the air war. It was the movie star, rugged, handsome, the hero of Memphis Belle. The BE-24 Liberator was forgotten. It was the workhorse that nobody loved but the men who flew it. It was harder to fly than the BE-17. It was more fragile. It was uglier. But the numbers don't lie. The BE-24 was produced in greater numbers than any other American military aircraft in history. Over 18,400 were built. It flew more missions than the BE-17. It dropped more tonnage of bombs. It served in every theater of the war, from the ice of the Aleutians to the jungles of Burma. And it was the BE-24 that flew the longest, hardest missions to destroy the oil industry that kept Germany fighting. After the war, the BE-24s didn't get a victory lap. They were flown to desert boneyards. Massive guillotines chopped off their tails. They were melted down into aluminum ingots to build post-war housing and appliances. Within a few years, almost all of them were gone. The German commanders who had mocked them were in prison or dead. But they had learned a hard lesson. They had judged a weapon by its looks and its tactical weaknesses. They had ignored its strategic capability. The B-24 was the perfect weapon for an industrial war. It was a long-range delivery system that could be manufactured by the thousands. It was the ugly, unglamorous, indispensable machine that ground the Luftwaffe into dust. The B-17 may have gotten the glory, but the B-24 won the war.